Welcome to the latest edition of the Blythe Tapes, and this is my part of my YouTube channel where I have a chat to people who are involved in various capacities in the publishing industry. So I'll be talking to various novelists and artists, and today we are going to be taking the approach of talking about editing and the process of selling your book, the stuff which is aimed at first-time novelists. And I'm joined by Helen Bryant, who is the founder of Cornerstones, and Cornerstones is a very successful international literary consultancy. I work for them as one of their editors, and Helen is also the author with her co-writer Catherine Price of On Editing: How to Edit Your Novel the Professional Way, which is published by John Murray. And Helen set up Cornerstones to champion new fiction and to enable writers to produce the best possible book that they could to approach publishers with and agents with. Good morning, Helen.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, thank you for being on. I've just been working out that actually with your publishing background, you may have overlapped with me slightly at Penguin, because my first novel, The Cut, came out with Penguin in the late 90s. So
oh wow, with which imprint?
So it was Penguin paperback, and it was Tony Lacey was my editor. And
he
then
sat across the way from me.
Right. Okay. And then I had Losing Faith out with Hamish Hamilton in a couple of years after that. So yeah, and then Penguin and I went our separate ways, as is often the way with these things. We'll talk about your book, and we'll talk about Cornerstones and anything else that we find interesting, really, because thinking back to those sort of days in the 90s in publishing, I mean, I don't know if you find this, but a lot of the advice that I'm asked about first-time publishing is sometimes out of date, and the kind of the process that I went through is very different from the process that an author would be going through now. Do you think there's been a lot of changes in that respect?
Well, I mean, the last time I worked in the publishing house was 28 years ago, so I'm not entirely sure. Although I have been published, obviously, so I've had some experience of how things work. I mean, what we do anyway at Cornerstones is work with an author at grassroots level. So we're all about editing and, you know, lifting them, raising them a level. So, I mean, I strongly believe that you can teach self-editing techniques. Can't teach great writing, but you can teach an author how to unpick a novel and put it back together again. And then of course I scout for agents, so that's my other sort of inroad into how the industry works. I do, going back to your question, I remember Lee Weatherly, who used to run the children's section of Cornerstones, and we wrote a book together called Write a Blockbuster. And when she got her publisher, which was David Fickling, he would say to her, her first novel, you need to do this and you need to do that, and she would say, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. And he would sit her down and take her through how to strengthen character and how to rearrange scenes and scene structure, how to increase pace and tension and all of that. And she said, thank God for that, because she had no idea as a first-time author how to translate what the editor was saying to her into strengthening her book. So David Fickling's advice came from Lee, that went into our book, then became On Editing, and then became basically the cornerstone of Cornerstone's way. And I do remember him saying that with publishing, and this was sort of 20 years ago, it's a lot less forgiving than it used to be. So editors would take authors out for lunch, and they would allow a book to sort of do okay, but then the writer would develop their style and grow with their audience. And then, you know, it was a much more sort of encompassing experience. But now, if your first book dies a death with EPOS, electronic point of sale, and bookshops, however much your publisher is saying to the bookshop, bookseller, book 2's amazing, they'll say book 1 didn't do very well. So I just feel it's a little tighter, harsher, a bit more businesslike, maybe.
And there's a lot of reinvention going on as well, I think, and there's people chopping and changing, jumping from one publisher to another, and starting with different names too. And I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I can remember when I first got published by Penguin, I'd had a couple of Doctor Who books out with Virgin. They were sort of looked on upon a bit snobbishly by the literary imprints. When my agent sold the cut to Penguin, and yeah, they did exactly that. Took me out for lunch and had lots of wonderful promises, and to be fair, did really well, because they got me a review in the Times and quite a bit of other exposure, some radio stuff. Got the book, you know, front facing in Waterstones, Virgin Megastore, and at the time I didn't appreciate what a big deal that was. I just thought this was normal, and I'd imagined, you know, being taken on by a publisher and they would publish all of my subsequent books, and that you know, I would have my backlist continually reprinted, because that was what had happened with the writers I'd read in my late teens, early 20s, who I admired, people like Julian Barnes, Ian Banks, Martin Amis, you know, people who managed to juggle being commercially successful as well as being literary. And yeah, the harsh realities hit, as they do with a lot of authors. So yeah, this is something that we have to be realistic to new authors about, that yeah, the promises made by publishers are you know, not always going to be able to be fulfilled. And I agree with what you said as well about it being possible to teach editing and good writing. It absolutely is. I mean, I've taught on the creative writing MA at Sheffield Hallam, and I've defended that, because people say, how do you teach writing? You can't teach writing. And of course you can. You can teach good writing in the same way you can teach people who are reasonably talented musicians to be good musicians, and people who are talented artists to be really outstanding artists. So yeah, it can be taught, and I think your book takes a very sort of structured approach to this, and quite a very sort of well illustrated through examples approach as well. You've divided it into 2 sections, about editing and about marketing, and I like what you've done with the examples there. And I wondered if this was a conscious decision, because you've got 3 different types of illustrative examples. You've got the ones that you've written yourself, and you've got the ones that you refer to people you've worked with, how you develop their books, and you then refer to examples from published fiction as well. It's nice to have that balance with the 3 different sorts of examples to refer to.
Yeah, so I mean, it took so our book Write a Blockbuster, after 10 years of it being published, I think it was, Catherine and I felt that we had really sort of grown and developed how we teach writers. So we wanted to sit down and really delve in deep, which is where on editing came from. And it took us, I don't know, about a year and a half or so to write. We would brainstorm and then create together her examples of, so it's very hard to write slightly bad prose to show.
Absolutely, yeah.
Telling, not showing, and that kind of thing, and then seeing how you might edit it to strengthen it. And so that was quite fun. And then, of course, that was the basis of our online editing course, which Catherine teaches and Lee also teaches. Yeah.
It's very good to, like you say, those examples work really well, and you've got to write things that are slightly off in a way. The paragraphs that you've written, and you've given examples of dialogue which, for example, sounds realistic but is also a bit clunky, which is, it's really hard to get that nuance. And I've tried to do that for my classes I've taught with the WEA, World Educational Association, and for kids as well. I do a lot of school visits, as regular viewers will know, and yeah, it's very hard to do. I actually gave up trying to produce my own examples, and in the end I just use examples from published fiction, and we discuss those. It's difficult to do. You start out, this is something which interests me, because you start out talking about the big idea You say that writers need to have a big idea for the book, and this is something which ties in with what we're hearing, I think, from agents and from publishers. The concept, the high concept novel is very popular right now, isn't it? So how important is this, the big idea to kick off the book?
Do you know, I think the first thing you have to work through is, what do you most want to explore as a writer? What drives you to unearth and dig deep, be it theme or something external like plot, you know, adventure, or I don't know, some thriller in space, or is it a married couple's marriage falling apart, that kind of thing. So what interests you? What do you most want to get out of your story? Because that will be the spine, the core that drives everything, the plot and the character, and it will keep you interested as an author, and therefore if you're interested, then your reader's going to be interested. So I think first of all, it's identifying what you want to explore. And then I mean, for me, it's about character, because you can have bombs exploding, you can have marriages falling apart, but if you don't care about the characters, you're not going to care about what happens. So what happens is plot, and then characters, and empathetic characters, 360-degree characters, where and at the heart of both plot and character is conflict. So if you're constantly trying to put between everything in a cause and effect way, something happens in the story, the character reacts, and then they push the story forward. But continually, I think anyway, if you right at the beginning work out who your protagonist is and what their deepest core fear or quest is, and it can be both, and then the story should constantly test that at the end of the story, you're going to have a character that's grown, right? Even if they haven't grown, and that's the message.
Yeah. There are a great many answers to this question which writers always get asked, which is one is, where do your ideas come from, and the other is, what's your book about? And people who hear that I'm a writer, and they say, oh, what's your latest book about then? And it's really hard to answer, because exactly as you just said, do they mean character? Do they mean theme? Do they mean plot? You know, how do you sum up what it's about? What the book is about is going to be different for every writer. And some people will start with the big concept, but some, absolutely, as you say there, Helen, will start with the character and the choices that the character makes. And that's something I often come back to in the reports that I do for you, because that's something which a lot of new authors haven't quite grasped yet, which is that you're not writing a situation, you're writing a story. If there's one thing which is common to a lot of imperfect first drafts of first novels, it's they're just writing about a situation, and it's not a story which is driven by choices which characters make. There's one which I use as an example to kids, actually, because a lot of them have seen the first Star Wars film, and so I refer to this scene in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker goes to see Obi-Wan Kenobi, and talks about being a Jedi, and you know, decides that he's not going to, and gets back in his land speeder and goes back to his home, and there he finds his homestead has been destroyed, and his aunt and uncle have been massacred by the stormtroopers, and that's the turning point in the story. That's where he makes a choice. So he gets back in his land speeder, goes back to Obi-Wan Kenobi and says, I'm ready to become a Jedi. And that's where the whole of Star Wars begins. And kids love that example because they can all relate to it, and they've all seen it. And on some level, you know, all books have got their I'm ready to become a Jedi moment, haven't they? There's a choice that a character makes, for good or ill, which is decisive in the course of the plot.
And it's what we call the inciting event. So what tips the character into the story, what therefore tips the reader into the story. And it's usually around a point of conflict.
Yeah, there's got to be conflict. I mean, that's another thing which I pick people up on a lot as well, and I'm sure lots of your other editors do as well. Is the manuscript which doesn't appear to have that kind of dynamic in it, because there isn't enough conflict between the characters, or the conflict is not sufficiently strong, or not sufficiently driven, or it's artificially kind of grafted on to the action, and plot's got to arise out of that conflict and out of the choices that the characters make. I find characterization really difficult. I mean, I'm sure that's true of a lot of people. I think of all the things that I do as a writer, I think it's probably the hardest thing.
I was talking to an author who happens to be one of our editors the other day, and she'd ground to a halt on her 9th book, slightly ground to a halt. And she said, help. And I said, come on, let's jump on and have a brainstorm session and see what's going on.
It's good to know that can still happen, because I've done 10 and a dozen or so shorter books, and I still find that I sometimes think, I can't do this anymore, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, Dan, I don't know about you. I'm not a published novelist, but I don't think that ever goes away.
Not unusual, no.
But then that's the challenge, isn't it? That's the cliff, mountain you have to climb. And if you're climbing it and it's difficult and the obstacles in your way, then it's going to come through authentically, isn't it, as a story?
Absolutely, yeah.
So anyway, I was saying to her what's going on, and we unpacked everything, and she had a lot of sort of almost, we worked out 3 characters but in different time zones, so therefore 6 arcs going on, and then the overarching arc. And she said, okay, well, I've kind of got this plot, and I wrote an extended synopsis for my agent, and she's happy with that. She said, but I don't know where to begin. My character's not speaking to me. I'm 10,000 words in. And I said, we talked various points, and then I said, have you interviewed your character? Have you actually gone and had a cup of tea with your character? Have you ever done that?
Yeah, I mean, I have this exercise that I do with kids in school workshops, where we have this character map, and we have, it's basically, it's like a hot seating sort of interrogation thing, and you write down, what would your character have for breakfast? What would your character watch on television? What would they wear? And then we have all of the more sort of the kind of deep delving questions. How would your character react to a racist? How would your character you know, what's the thing they'd least like to do? How are they afraid of anything? And we get some great answers.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
Really think about this. I mean, yeah, some of them just put like celebrities or their own friends as the standard answers, but some of them really do think quite hard, and it's good to see. And they're always amazed when I tell them at the end of the session, you know, you've created something which wasn't there an hour ago.
Yeah, and then they get to feel what it's like to be like mini gods. They're creating something, their own creation, and it's building, and it starts to have an energy, and then your character starts forming and
comes to life. Yes.
Yeah. No, I was talking more about, yes, all of those questions. You need to know your character intimately, down to, did she ever have an overdraft and what does she then do, type thing. I was talking about an exercise that an author once told me about, where you get a big piece of paper, having done all your mind maps and everything, and you ask the first question. If your character's not speaking to you, in your right hand, ask your character, who are you? And with your left hand, answer, so it's your subconscious coming through. And it's amazing, apparently. The answers are completely not what you might expect. And that is when your character, if your character is allowed to speak and allowed to emerge authentically, that is what you might then start running with.
That's a great idea. I mean, I hope some people listening will find that useful, because that's a bit of a, unusual approach to it. Yes, get your subconscious working. Okay, yeah. Well,
because it's very easy to put plot onto character.
Yeah.
And then, you know, work out how your character is going to react, and it might feel a bit clunky that way. But that's you directing it as the author rather than your character.
Great. Yeah. What interests me as well, attached to that, is, I think it always comes in, I bring it in with character in the reports I do for you, which is this question of the viewpoint. And I think there are things which slip through even in published novels which irk me now to do with viewpoint, because I'm so attuned to it. And my first editor, Peter Darvill-Evans at Virgin Books, his sort of maxim that stuck with me all this time is, writing a novel is very hard, and if you find it easy, you're doing something wrong. And he said this in particular relation to viewpointing, because we were all quite young writers. Most people published in the Virgin New Adventures were in our early 20s, and didn't really know what we were doing. And viewpointing was something which I just realized I hadn't got hang off at all. And Peter described it as slaloming down a hill and just about managing to avoid hitting the trees. And he said, how did you manage to avoid hitting the trees doing this? And once you realize what viewpointing is all about, then you realize that you have been doing it wrong. And I mentioned it there because I always link it to character, but for just you've spent a lot of time on this in your book, so just tell us a bit about viewpointing and how people get it wrong and how it should be done right.
Sure. So you basically have to sit within your character as you're entering the scene, and everything is through their viewpoint. So, and it might be first person, third person, there are others, but that's the simplified version. And then what they see and how they react to that, and how they then reflect internally without telling, of course. So how they interpret what's happening, and then how does that make them question something that is happening? That has to be in their voice. So if your character's, American, she's not going to, and sort of rather dreamy, she's not going to interpret what's happening within the scene as someone who's more pragmatic and British. They would use different words. They might, everything has to remain true and authentic to that character and their voice, down to the word choice and down to their reactions. Yeah. And I think if you are very strict, especially if you have multiple viewpoints within your novel, you have to be really strict as to which character is experiencing that scene and who's speaking. Then it comes down to voice, and it's sounding as naturalistic as possible.
And I think that people often can't sort of quite grasp this at first when they're doing a third person narrative, and they slip very easily into the omniscient because they think, well, it's third person, therefore it must be omniscient, and they forget exactly what you were saying then about voice. When I spoke to David Bishop, who's the author of City of Vengeance, we talked about this as well, and he talked about the importance of tone and rhythm and vocabulary, and the three things that they always come back to characterize a voice. And yeah, it can be quite hard to explain to first-time novelists, and you get sometimes as well as the slip into the omniscient, you get the dreaded head hop, don't you? That's another of my bugbears.
Yeah, I don't think there are certain genres that can carry that off well, if it's a conscious choice that the author has made. Something like a thriller might work quite well with head hopping, multiple viewpoints, but it has to be done consciously, seamlessly, and consistently. Rather than something that the author's just fallen into without realizing.
Have to know what they're doing, no.
And then the omniscient viewpoint is useful if you don't want the reader to get to know that character. It can be seen at the beginning of a novel, perhaps, where let's take a thriller, you're seeing the killer stirring his vat in his cellar, and you don't necessarily want to get to know him too intimately, or her, or even it, you might not know who it is. And then, so that it's the camera lens, isn't it? So the author can deliberately pull back on the camera lens, and that can be omniscient and used for fantasy and all sorts. But then you have to, what we call intimate third person, and it is almost as close as first person. It's almost as close as switching I for she.
Yeah. Close third person. Yeah, absolutely. I was just reminded then when you were talking about the murder thriller, Ian Banks's Complicity. It's one of the few books that I remember reading which uses second person for the viewpoint of the killer, which I thought was very clever, because it not only disguises who the killer is, it disguises the sex of the killer, without having to use first person. So it's very, very cleverly done. I should just explain for people who are wondering what head hopping is. It's where you are inside the viewpoint of one character, and then within the same scene, you're suddenly within the viewpoint of another. So you're seeing everything from John's point of view, describing everything John sees and John feels, and you can see Jane on the other side of the room, and then suddenly you're talking about Jane and what Jane can see, and she sees John coming in within the same scene, and that can be very jarring once you recognize it. But then, like you say, if people who absolutely know what they're doing and can manage it well can do it. I've just read Emily St. John Mandel's The Glass Hotel, which has a chapter entirely done in first person plural. So yeah, it's we for all from the start, and it's everybody who is involved in the scheme, which is at the heart of this book, gets a paragraph, and she seamlessly glides between 7 or 8 people within the course of this first person plural chapter. And I was in awe of this. I thought, how good is this? And it must have been so hard to write, and I wouldn't recommend new novelists to try that. I had in Exiles, my last book, I had 12 viewpoints, which I found really hard to juggle. I think previous books I'd done had only had, 3 or 4. Is there an ideal number if you're doing a third person narrative? Is there a number beyond which it becomes unwieldy?
I personally like 2 or 3, but 12, my God, you're looking at, presumably, Dan, you would have done a character arc for all 12 and then the overarching arc.
To an extent. I mean, some of them are only minor characters, so they only get 3 or 4 scenes, but they all develop to some extent. Yeah, and it has got a whodunit aspect to it as well. So I was desperately trying all the way through to try and hide who the perpetrator was. Yeah. So
how did you find it more to the point?
Well, I found it very difficult. It's the most difficult thing I've ever written, and that book, as my agent will tell you, took rather longer to deliver than I had expected it to. And I'm now working on the sequel, which possibly has just as many viewpoints. So we'll see how that goes. Connected to character, you talk in the book a lot about dialogue as well, and you've used these examples you've described of clunky dialogue, which is hard to create. The trap people fall into here, I think, is one which you very correctly point out in your chapter on dialogue, is where people seem to be just speaking their mind directly. Something that script writers sometimes call on the nose dialogue, where they're just saying what they think and very blandly and boldly. How do writers avoid that trap?
2 things. I think writers often use their characters as a voice piece for them, their thoughts, to explain plot or backstory or how a character's interpreting something, and you can spot that a mile off. So never in an expositional sense use your characters. And the other is to not forget dialogue cushioning. I think with that rhythm and fall of the style and the prose, you need to have a block of dialogue is okay, as long as it warrants it. But quite often we see blocks of dialogue with nothing going on, no plot, no interpretation, no behavioral reactions. It needs that cushioning often to allow us to feel like we're fully in a scene rather than just in a block of dialogue.
Yeah, I think people often forget as well that you don't need to have continual dialogue tags, especially with adverbs. I've seen these pages and pages of dialogue which have then got almost kind of methodically after each one, exclaimed Mark delightedly, responded Julie, hideously, whatever. It gets so repetitive and so contrived, and you don't need that a lot. It should be clear who's speaking. If your characterization is good enough, it should be clear from the dialogue who is speaking, and people shouldn't take it in turns to speak either. I think that's something people often forget. They cut across each other, they interrupt each other, they speak in half-formed sentences. Some people will swear, others won't. Some people will use slang and others won't. All these differences you can create between characters using dialogue.
I think you can also have point of real tension within dialogue. So characters in a novel, if they're sort of feeling very natural and they know one another, you might have a couple arguing about something, but the reader isn't party to exactly what they're arguing about, because the characters know exactly what they're arguing about and they know all the points of reference. So, you remember when we went on that boat trip and then, oh God, but that was an accident. That wasn't meant to happen. Do you know what I mean?
It's sort of, so either the reader will know what that's about, or they won't when there's
or they won't, and then they will. It will make sense at some point. There'll be a relevance. That's what we call pacing. imparting to the reader, knowing what to impart and when to the reader. Try and hold things back as much as you can without teasing.
Let's talk a bit about pacing, because that is something that I pick up on a lot in reports, and I find that one thing which affects people's pacing is the irrelevant or excess information which they dwell on far too much, and then really important aspects of the story are glossed over. And I've seen this quite a few times, often in fantasy and sci-fi. I don't know why it's particular to that kind of writing, but you get really important things dashed off in a paragraph, and they've just spent a whole chapter discussing the preparations for a great banquet or whatever, which I'm not really interested in.
Yeah.
So it's getting that balance right.
Probably what they're doing is they're going into their scene and they're picking their way and they're visualizing it, they're writing and visualizing it, and then they realize the point of the tension point within that scene, and then they think, well, if it suddenly happens, then, and it's left on a cliffhanger, right, yeah, then they've done their job well. But actually probably what they want to look at is their scene and getting in late and out early. So you build with a scene, it's all about the anticipation, yeah, of the climax point within that scene. It's like a mini arc, isn't it? So here's my scene. It's going to do many things. It's going to be multifunctional as a scene. It's going to show the plot, the setting, a character and how they're reacting and what position they're in and how it pushes the character and how the character pushes the plot. And then what is that pinnacle climax moment? And you build up to that, and then you slow right down, like in a film. When a bomb goes off, the bomb doesn't just go off. You see the people sort of noticing slightly strange things and hearing tinking in there around them, and the glass splintering, and then, do you know what I mean? It's sort of
reaction, the tensions. Yeah, I often tell people that with on level of paragraph and a scene and the whole book, that how late can you go into this scene, how early can you come out of this scene, and how about the structure of a scene and the geography of a scene as well, where everybody is. And it's often something that they haven't given any thought to, but yeah, often a lot of cutting is involved, which can be quite painful. I certainly find it painful. The other issue with pacing, I think, is and I see this again a lot, really good opening chapters, lots of impetus at the beginning, lots of momentum, and then there's a sag. There's the sag, yeah, in the middle 100 pages or so. You know, I did a report recently. I don't think it was for you. I think it was for someone else, where characters spent literally 100 pages sitting in a hotel room discussing this mystery that they were investigating. I was thinking, get out there, you know, get out there with your torches and your investigating material, and, you know, go out on the moors and chase whatever it is you're chasing. Don't sit in a hotel room talking about it. That was the entire middle of the novel. So yeah, the saggy middle is a well-known thing, isn't it?
Yeah, the flat midsection. So the way to get around that is to have at least, the midsection probably takes the bulk of the novel. So we use the 3-act graph. Many people use the hero's journey 5-act graph. We use the 3-act graph because it's simple to visualize. So the Act 1, inciting events, setting, setup, character. It can be a paragraph, it can be a chapter, it can be 3 chapters, it can be half the book. So if that character had been stuck in a cell, you know, sort of looking back to what had happened and what went wrong, then that could have been a slightly different scenario. And then you've got the midsection, which, let's say if you're writing an 80,000 word novel, is 60,000 words, and within that midsection you need to have at least 3 rising tension peaks. You can have 27, but we like to see at least 3 rising ones, so more dramatic than the first. And then you've got the low point, high point, the false high, what people call the false high, where the reader character might as well close the book and everything's come true and good. And then you've got the low point where you take everything away, so they're worse off than when they started the novel. And then you've got the climax and the resolution. And once you know that those fundamental nuts and bolts things have to be seen, have to happen, you can start playing around with them. So you might start with a climax, or you might have 32 rising tension peaks, or you might have one, but you know, sort of like this, where it affects characters in different ways, but you have to know the rules to break them.
Absolutely. You don't need to write your book in order. You don't need to present
No.
the events in order. And that's something else I remember noticing when I read the Emily St. John Mandel book that I mentioned, the Glass Hotel, and she does it as well with Station 11. Things are presented out of chronological order. There's a very good diagram in your book, isn't there, of what you've just described, and I was trying to find it to hold it up, but maybe I'll put a still of it up when I edit the video, of the structure that you've just been talking about. As you say, some people use Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey, which I found very useful to talk about in workshops. There's the old classic from Writing for Television by Malcolm Hulke, which is the dramatic W as well.
Yeah.
Starting and then peaking and then ending on a high. Yeah, but there are lots of different variations of that. But I don't think it matters which structure you work to, as long as you have a structure, and don't be afraid to mess around with it. So bringing everything to a conclusion in a book is again a problem. I think, you know, people need to bear in mind that the story's ending, story denouement, has to come about from choices that the characters have made, from things that have happened earlier on in the plot. It shouldn't be imposed. It shouldn't be like a deus ex machina kind of imposition. What are the things people find difficult about finishing a novel?
Sometimes I think it's a party that the author's really, really enjoying and they don't want to leave. So the ending can sort of drag on a bit. So my advice is know when to leave a good party and let the characters carry.
Yeah.
It's got, I would like to see various things that were set up in the story resolved, so it makes sense as to why we invested in it in the first place as a reader. So it doesn't have to be a happy ending, it just has to feel satisfactory.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it can be a bittersweet ending, as long as everything seems to come together. We're glossing over a lot of things here, Helen, but they're all in your book. On Blythe Tapes today, I am talking to Helen Bryant, who is the co-author of On Editing, How to Edit Your Novel the Professional Way, and all these things that we are talking about are in her book. Let's just talk as well about the other part of the process. Once you've got your novel done, you've got it edited, you might have been to Cornerstones for a report, you've been through several different drafts, you want to get an agent, you want to be published. What are the pitfalls here? What are the key things people need to remember? First of all, I mean, let's talk about getting an agent. What kind of things will an agent be looking for, if we can possibly sum that up? So
people often think that agents are not looking for books. They're so busy, they want to, the first reason to turn something down, which is true, but they are always excited about their pot of gold. They always are driven to discover the next new thing.
That's right.
And that might be a book, high concept book, really well written, the first sentence and page that draws the agent in and poses the question and makes them want to turn that page. I think keep it simple. So when do your research for one. So you work out who you want to target, never blanket submit, who you want to target and why. Maybe you've read an article, or maybe you follow them on Twitter. Maybe you went to a writers' conference and heard them speak. And that's probably going to be the first point of relevance. You have to work out why an agent should pick out your submission out of the 6,000 that they get. Make it relevant to them. State in your cover letter what it is you're submitting, title, genre, word length, a few sentences as to what it's about, then a few sentences on you as the writer, and thank them for their time. And also say whether you've submitted to more than them, so it's not on exclusive. Just say you submitted to 3 or 4 other agents, and you'll let them know of any developments.
Used to be a bit of a no-no, that, I think, when I was first sending out stuff in the 90s, we were told not to do that, but now it's I think it's perfectly a business-like way of going about things, as long as you say that you've done that. Cover letter.
You don't have to mention who.
No,
you just have to, because I have had experiences of agents or heard agents really, really furious, where they've sent off a manuscript to be read and paid for that, and then they come back excited and gone to the author, and the author said, "Oh, sorry, I forgot to let you know, I actually got taken on."
Yeah, which is very
Last month.
unprofessional. Yeah, no, and there are some really good examples in your book of good cover letters as well, the kind of thing to put in, not to copy directly, but certainly to get some ideas of how to structure it, because it is quite an art to do. And then there's the synopsis as well, which people find very difficult. I find difficult. I find very hard thing to do, because you are boiling your book down to the absolute essence, aren't you? And you're not showing off with your style. You're not, you know, you're not doing it in the style of the book. You're saying, right, this is the plot, and put the end in as well, for goodness sake. Always put the conclusion in. People think you've got to leave it on a cliffhanger like a blurb, but that's not what a synopsis is. So people send off a query letter, and then an agent will usually ask for the first 3 chapters and a synopsis, and if you're really lucky, then you will be asked for the full manuscript. That's when
I kind of think they should,
interesting.
When an author submits, they should attach the first 10 pages or something to give the agent a flavour.
Yeah.
Because an agent is not going to make that decision to call something in or to read material if they don't privately, secretly, haven't had a chance to have a look at the first page.
Yeah. They don't. I mean, yes, some people are very good at doing a paragraph, which is a pitch and sums up the tone of the whole book. But if you've got, essentially at some point they've got to read some of your writing.
The first thing an agent will do is get a check that it's for them and not wasting their time. And the first thing they'll do is turn to the first page.
Yeah, and you can often tell, can't you? I mean, this surprises my writing students in the past when I've said to them, sometimes an agent or an editor can tell whether a book is for them within the first paragraph, often within the first sentence. And I use a sort of culinary metaphor. I say, well, you can tell if you're having a bowl of soup or something and it's horrible, you're not going to have the rest of it, or if it's not to your taste, you're not going to have the rest of it. So and that helps people to understand it. It's still a very tough business, isn't it? And I think it's as tough as it was when I first tried to get published. And I've noticed a lot of younger writers have a kind of alternative approach, in that some people think they've got to set up their whole social media profile first, and get a, because this is the way they've seen influencers and celebrities doing it. I must have my YouTube, I must have my Instagram, I must have all my followers, and then I can approach an agent and say, look, I've got 5,000 followers for my cosplay account or my model building account or whatever. To me, that seems like putting the cart before the horse, but
I mean, it helps, especially if they do something that has an immediate following stroke sales potential. But it doesn't have to be that way. I think for non-fiction it's particularly important, but it's not absolutely vital either.
No, I think it's, absolutely. You've got to, for non-fiction is very, very different. And that's, I mean, I've sold non-fiction on the basis of just an outline, which I never have for fiction. And a lot of it is about your credentials too, which is not so much with fiction. Helen, we've covered an enormous amount there, and I will just mention again that your book is called On Editing, How to Edit Your Novel the Professional Way. It's published by John Murray, which is a division of Hachette, and is out there as an ebook and a normal book. And Helen is also the head, what is your official title at Cornerstones? Head honcho of Cornerstones, I call you.
I'll go with head honcho.
Head honcho of Cornerstones, which is the international literary consultancy which champions new fiction. And so, there are a number of different editors, such as me, who will work on your book and help you to get your book to be as good as it possibly can be before it goes out there to the market. Helen, thanks very much for your time today, and I will put the Cornerstones website up there for people to look at as well. If there is one thing that people can take away, someone sitting out there with their half-formed novel or their idea for a novel, what's the one thing you could tell them that will give them heart and encourage them and set them on the right track?
I totally keep going, even when it feels hard and you're not getting anywhere. Just keep at it, because it's the most amazing thing. Writing, whether it's, going to get published or not, even let go of the idea of it being published or not. If you're enjoying yourself, if it's escapist for you, then it's going to be escapist for your reader.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say don't get hung up on the idea of this being the one and only chance and your one and only thing that you write, because, you know, I wrote 5 or 6 novels of increasingly reducing rubbishness before I had something looked at. So it might,
yeah, nothing is ever a waste.
no,
it's all a learning curve.
Absolutely. And I still do that. I've got a file on my computer which is called bits and bobs, and I shove bits in there that I don't use, and at some point I will come back to them.
Yeah.
Helen, thank you very much for your time, and it's been really interesting. I know we've skated over a lot of things which require a lot more in-depth discussion, but I hope that has encouraged and inspired a few people out there. My guest on the Blythe Tapes today has been Helen Bryant. Helen, thank you for your time, and bye for now.
Pleasure. Thank you.